So, in today's episode of Let's Get Naked, we are discussing 3 reasons why ego is not the enemy. I encourage you, if something stimulates you either positively and gets you curious, then leave a comment, ask a question, engage with this information in such a way to expand your understanding. The same goes for if this information stimulates you negatively. Be curious, ask a question, and engage with this information to expand your understanding. Okay, so that's the goal, if you will, of sharing with you in this platform is to engage your curiosity, to stimulate your mind, to expand your capacity for understanding. And this topic about the ego is often, I'm not going to say sensitive, but it's polarizing. The idea of ego a lot of times can make people on the defensive and or judgmental, calling out egoic situations, egotistical people, et cetera, et cetera. So we're just going to dive right in. We're going to talk about it and we're going to see what comes up. Okay. So the first reason why ego is not the enemy, number one, is because the ego is a self concept. Okay. The ego is a self concept. So what's a self concept then? The word, and if you look it up in the dictionary, the word concept is an abstract idea or a general notion. Okay, ego is a self concept, and a concept, obviously, we're talking about self, who you think you are, who I think I am, right? That's what we think ego is. Um, it's an abstract notion or idea. So then I went and looked up the word abstract, just to put it all out here on the table, right? Just so we know what we're working with. And abstract means it's existing in thought or as an idea, but not having any physical or concrete existence. So, in other words, the ego is a made up idea of ourselves. Okay, it's not actual. I like to say it's an idea. The ego is a self concept. So it's an idea of ourselves um, that is there to create this context and the construct, the contrast actually for our experience of the world. And we'll get more into that in just a minute, but I want to get to the second reason why ego is not the enemy, and that's because it is on purpose. Okay, so if the ego is an abstract idea of self, it's made up so that, number two, it's on purpose, so that we may experience the contrast and the context of the world that we live in, inclusive of our bodies and one another and all of the fun stuff that we get to experience as human beings. Um, and we actually need the ego in order to play the game of life. Okay, so it is on purpose. So it is not an enemy. It is not something that we need to eliminate in any way or even overcome. Okay, the overcoming of the ego is the simple, it's let me overcome my idea of me. Well, you just overcome that idea by having another idea, right? And we don't actually ever overcome, not entirely, we don't actually ever overcome the idea of ego, except by perceiving ego as on purpose, not something to be eliminated, but something to be integrated. Okay? So without the ego, we wouldn't be able to experience the context and the content of the world as we know it. inclusive of our thoughts and our feelings and our perceptions of ourselves and the world. Okay. The ego is also what I call a meaning maker. Okay. Our senses are taking in the information of the world, and then the ego is interpreting that or giving various bits of information meaning. So again, this ego thing is super duper necessary. um, and it's not something to overcome. Okay. Um, while it is the meaning maker, it's also not in charge. Okay. So it's not the creator. The ego is not the creator. The creator is that infinite, indivisible, eternal I. Okay. The ego is um, a localization of that infinite and remember, it's a thought, it's a concept. Okay. It's a concept of self. And so this self concept, this idea of self, is what's interpreting all that is. Okay, is the interpreter of reality. And therefore, it's necessary for the I to have this localized, individualized experience of itself. So, but the ego, while it's the meaning maker, it's not the creator. It's not in charge. Okay, so there's where we get a little bit sideways. We think our ego is who we are, right? It's made up of, again, it's an idea that's made up of perceptions, an identity of ourself, if you will, but it's not real, it's abstract, it's not concrete or physical. It simply is an interpretation um, of self, and it's not in charge. That's where we go sideways, is we think the ego is the ultimate. We think it is the one that is creating our experience. It's not, it's interpreting our experience, okay? But because we perceive our ego to be the generator of our experience, and we also perceive our ego to be our identity, the extent of who we are, oftentimes. Um, by bestowing that power upon our ego, we then perpetuate the idea that the ego, our thoughts and our perceptions and interpretations of the world are creating us, are creating that world. Okay. So I know this can get a little convoluted, so stick with me. And again, if this conversation is stimulating, if a question comes up or some aspect of what I'm sharing is um, unclear, too convoluted, then by all means drop a comment and ask a question, because I do much better in that type of interaction by answering questions. Okay. In fact, I'm giving an interactive lecture a little bit later this week. So I encourage you to come to class, and let's dive into and unravel these complex concepts together. Okay. Um, one more thing I want to say about the ego is not in charge, but it is interpreting and assigning meaning to the information that we experience. That reminded me of that Bible scripture, I and my Father are one, but my Father is greater than I, or something similar to that. So the I and my Father. Okay, if we look at what that really means, I is the individual self concept. We call that ego. So I, the individual self concept, and my Father, the infinite, eternal, indivisible isness, are one, right? because I, the individual concept of self, am an idea in the infinite through which the interpretation and experience of the infinite is had. How about that? I, individual interpreter, and my Father, infinite isness, are one. And my Father is greater than I. The infinite isness is greater than the individual interpreter. And yet, we are one because in infinite isness is indivisible. It cannot be any other way. Okay? There's only one source. There's only one being. There's only one consciousness in which I, the individual interpreter, exist. And there's another Bible quote, and I haven't read the Bible, but I've heard some quotes. Um, I quote scriptures, whatever, and I forget what it is now, but it's the one where it's like, I live, move, live, breathe, and have my movement in or something. Someone type that shit in the comments so that we know what we're talking about here. You know the one I'm talking about, right? Um, and that isness, that infinite isness that is indivisible, has to have an agency in order to experience itself. It knows itself, but it's not experiencing itself. It knows itself as infinite. It is infinite, and it knows because it's aware, self-aware, but it can't experience its infinite self without the agency of the individual interpreter, you and me. Okay? So I love this understanding, and I encourage you to dig into this stuff if you want to understand your ultimate nature. If you want to understand, if you want to more than understand, it's not just an intellectual understanding. In fact, this shit is mind-boggling, and it goes against the primary paradigm we have been living our entire lives in. So it's not going to actually make sense to your logical mind, but it absolutely will to your all-knowing heart. Okay? And that's what Let's Get Naked, this podcast, is designed to stimulate your heart, your soul, stripped of its conditions and identities and personalities and all those things that we think make up us. Yeah, I mean, they're fun, but they aren't the fundamental. Ooh, there's a new um, catchphrase. The ego is fun, but not fundamental to our being. Okay. All right, I'm just riffing here, y'all. So, all right, so the ego then is the agent of experience. Without the ego, the individual interpreter, you and me, without this ego, we would simply exist in like that sort of suspended, expansive, ethereal state without the context and the contrast, right? Without the dark, we wouldn't know the light. You get that? Okay, so the contrast that we experience through the mechanism of our ego, the agent of our ego, is what allows infinite isness to experience its infinite beingness. Pretty cool stuff. All right. The third reason why ego is not the enemy is because it's not bad. Hopefully, you're starting to feel that now. The ego is not bad. It gets a bad rap from, I think, probably like people like Freud and stuff, but even all the way back to the Bible, right? The where Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden for eating from the tree of good and evil or knowledge, right? That simply that simply set the stage for the contrast that is necessary to have this ongoing, expansive experience of the infinite isness. Okay? That story, and it's a story, is designed so that we can perpetuate that good bad, right? That contrast. And the idea of good and bad, in this case, the ego being good or bad, or not any of that, completely both or neither, quite frankly, this idea is made up. It's a concept. And it is perpetuated by things like original sin, for example. And then all of the stories that we continue to tell and hear repeatedly about things like arrogance and self-servedness and egotistical, and the definition that we've given to that, what we've made it mean, that with the meaning maker called our ego, right? So um, this this story of original sin, um, where these innocent humans simply were curious and partook of something they were curious about that then instantly gave them an awareness of contrast, right? They went from being in, well, the Garden of Eden or the kingdom of heaven where all is provided and all is well and all is abundant and all is love and all is, just beauty and just like perfection and just everything is. They went from the isness, the infinite isness, the infinite beingness, to being able to experience the opposite, brought about by their curious nature. Okay? So that story is actually a story about no one did anything wrong. That's the problem with that story's interpretation, that the original sin was someone doing something wrong, and so then they were punished for getting it wrong and making God angry or whatever, disobedience. That's just a bunch of bullshit, you guys. It's the curiosity and man being made in God's image. This is the curiosity, because you can partake of that tree, because you can perceive yourself in a certain way, because you can, right? That's the reason God, or the infinite isness or consciousness, we can call it all kinds of words, right? But God created man, God created the idea of an individual interpreter because God can. Because if you want to overlay human qualities on the infinite, first of all, that's another thing that we do that we doesn't fully serve us, because then we are limiting the infinite, and we're supposing that infinite isness is judgmental, likes some things and provides for some things, and doesn't like some things and will punish you for that shit. Not true. Okay, infinite isness or infinite consciousness, or God, if you like that word better, has no opinions. It's the individual interpreter, the ego, you and me, that has the ability to have an opinion and experience the thoughts, the sensations, the perceptions, and the outcomes, the physical. I keep pointing behind me because I'm like pointing at the stuff right behind me. Um, Based on that interpretation, that opinion, and what we make it mean. So we are blessed, chosen by virtue of your birth. You are chosen as an interpreter of the infinite information that is God. So the ego is simply the mechanism by which we get to experience God's infinite nature. And to think that the ego is bad based on this bullshit original sin story, um, it just sets us up to suffer. Now, it's on purpose, right? That was number two. It's on purpose, um, so that the expansion could continue. Because without that contrast, without the shadow, we can't know the light. Okay? Um, Without that contrast, then there's just that sort of suspended field of allness, of isness. So the field has to imagine, right? The ego is an idea, it's a concept, it's a meaning maker. So we have to interpret things to be unlike the infinite isness, which is love. Think of it that way, right? Um, Love, peace, oneness, unity, eternal, indivisible, imperturbable, perfection. Okay, so we have to have the ego in order to interpret the opposite of our nature. Um, but if we allow ourselves to see the ego as a concept, an idea, an abstract idea, it's made up and it's on purpose. It's here so that we may experience and expand our knowing of the infinite, of God, of our God nature, right? Um, and it's not bad, right? So we don't have to overcome it. We don't have to eliminate it. We don't need all of the personal development shit that we're doing or all of the healing treatments that we're doing. We don't need any of that. The ego thinks it does because it inherently believes that it is bad. Okay? The ego's fundamental concept of itself is that it is bad. Okay? The ego is the only thing that feels separate from God and therefore needs to work to earn readmittance, love, restoration. Okay? And so we have this entire world set up to play that game of being valued, being worthy of God's love. Um, so all of the success, all of the endeavors, all of that, oftentimes, I'm speaking very generally here, is for the purpose of restoring ourselves to that which we were cast out from. Like Adam and Eve cast out from the Garden of Eden, because they did something wrong and didn't deserve all of that beauty and abundance and security and love. Okay. So that's the story. The ego is perpetuating, and because it sees this situation as a problem, it's always looking to solve that problem. It's always looking to overcome that fundamental rejection. Okay. And so then we spend our entire lives playing out the theater of that misconception. Okay. The ego is a self concept with a misconception of itself for the purpose of playing the game of life. And if we wake up to this game that we're playing, then we can start to use the ego in such a way that continues to expand uh, the experience of life, the experience of the infinite isness. Okay, we can continue to expand and experience the world, and we can do it from a place of love and understanding, which doesn't mean all of a sudden all of the shit goes away, because we need the shit in order to know bliss. And you can translate that, right? So um, we need to experience sadness in order to know overwhelming joy. We need to experience lack and longing in order to know fulfillment. We need to experience disruption and distortion in order to know fluid flow, perfection. So it's all part of the game. The only thing that we can do, maybe let me say this differently. The thing to do differently when you recognize A, what the ego is, and B, what the game is that we're playing, and C, that we don't have to linger in the ego's negative interpretation of what's so, what life is, who you are, how the world works, etc. Right? Oh, this little thumb bubble is interesting. Um, so once we know how the like what the nature of the game is and who's playing the game, then we don't have to linger in the nonsense as long as we might have had we not known this stuff. Okay? So, all of that, the three reasons why the ego is not the enemy. Number one, it's a self concept. You've made it up, and we all are. Number two, it's on purpose. It's how we play the game of life. And number three, it's not bad. So this idea of original sin, getting kicked out of Eden for doing something bad, is just perpetuating way deep down in the subconscious, the collective subconscious, and causing us all of this strife and struggle and strain that is going on longer than necessary. That's all I'm saying. Okay. So we can see through that illusion and restore ourselves to power, right? Because what does it mean to be in the Garden of Eden or in the kingdom of heaven? It simply means I know I am infinite. And what does this knowing of self as infinite feel like? It feels like fucking power, and not the kind of power that the ego is interpreting and acting on to create control and manipulation, right? So there's the egoic power, the ego's interpretation of power, and then there's the actual power, the power of God, the power of our infinite being. And so I share this with you because there are two fundamental paradigms at play right now. Thumbs up. And the first paradigm is this paradigm that relies on separation, which is the game of the ego. You and I are separate. I have to save myself from this world, this dangerous world that's out to get me, unless I control it. And then I can feel safe, and then I can be successful, and then I can return to the Garden of Eden where God's love is, right? That's one paradigm that relies on separation, which relies on the ego continuing to interpret itself as bad, as something to be overcome, and as like who you really are, which is what we think. We think our ego is who we are, it's our identity, it's our self concept. But the second paradigm is one that we're stepping on into because it's time, because we have evolved, we have awakened a level of consciousness that's allowing this new paradigm to be seen and experienced by us. And this new paradigm relies on oneness. It relies on knowing. It relies on us seeing beyond the veil, the illusion that the ego creates, right? The veil, the illusion of separateness, of needing to, I don't know, overcome to prove value and worthiness. Excuse me. And so this new paradigm where we see clearly, we see ourselves clearly, we see through the veil of the ego to the infinite isness as the fundamental aspect of our being that is having an experience of itself as an individual interpretation, right? That's the free will that the ego has. We're free to interpret the infinite isness in any way we choose. Okay? The infinite isness doesn't have an opinion. And if we recognize that we are essentially that infinite isness, having an individual interpretation, and we utilize the meaning maker called our ego in such a way, we can become masters of the game of life. And I don't know about you, but I like being at the top of the game. I like knowing how shit works so that I can play full fucking out and have a good time doing it. I mean, think of people like Michael Jordan, right? He knew how to play the game. And once he knew how to play the game, he could play full out. He could get into flow state. He could become one, drop the ego, right? Not overcome it, but see it for what it is. It's useful at times and in the way at other times. And so when we know how to play the game, we can utilize our human beingness, our human apparatus to play the game full out, to expand and experience the isness that we are. All right, drop your questions in the comments and I will do my best to um, further contextualize this idea that ego is not the enemy. It's just how we play the game called life. All right, you guys, I love you so much, and I look forward to connecting with you, to engaging with you, to going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, with you and expanding this wonderful experience called life. So, oh, anybody that you think might be a great guest, I will be interviewing other experts, authors, and teachers who are in this field, the field of consciousness and non-duality. Um, and I absolutely am welcoming those connections. So the link below this video will take you to the Let's Get Naked podcast website, where there is a way to reach me and link up. All right, you guys, have a good one. Bye.